Meaghan, Cussen, and Walter Block take the position that drugs should be legal. And in this context, we need to keep in mind, but by drugs, they are not qualifying that at all, except that this would include any recreational drug. So it includes heroin, cocaine, PCP, ecstasy, as well as marijuana. Any drug should be legal is their position. Their arguments are plentiful, and most of their arguments are utilitarian based. And we're going to look at 10 different utilitarian based arguments. And they are focused on the expected results of legalizing drugs. So part of the nuance of investigating the arguments related to drug legalization are related to practical matters of what actually occurs when drugs are legalized. And since we've never been in a position in our culture where everything was legal, this is a matter of extrapolating from what we know now. One exception to the utilitarian-based arguments is the initial argument that is more rights-based. So let's look at that first argument. The first argument they provide is a libertarian argument for legalizing drugs. By libertarian here, we do mean libertarian in the political sense. The idea is that having drugs be illegal is a violation of personal liberty that is provided in the Constitution. And the part of the Constitution is in the preamble, the idea that we have a right to pursue happiness, and our founding documents emphasize the freedom to do with our bodies as we choose in our right to pursue happiness. So if we have the right to pursue happiness, that's true as long as it does not infringe on others' rights to life and property. There is an old saying, you have a right to swing your arm around and your fist, but it stops at another person's nose, right? You don't have the right to swing your fist into somebody's face. So there is that limit. But barring that idea of harming somebody else, taking away one's right to pursue happiness through drugs would be to make a person a slave of the state, is the position of Cussen and Block. Now, since there are so many arguments that they are providing, 11 total, I will provide a brief criticism from the other perspective as we go through the arguments. Not always, but often we will do that. So here's a question. Do you think that you are enslaved due to a restriction on taking drugs, certain drugs? They say that this makes you a slave of the state. I think, of course, they might acknowledge this is hyperbole. It seems like there are many other restrictions on us, some for our benefit, wearing a seatbelt, wearing a helmet while driving a motorcycle, at least in certain states. How about the requirement to use headlights when driving at night? It's not like everything that the state requires us to do is making us a slave. We're not just free to decide to drive without headlights, but that doesn't really enslave us. Now, I think the real concern for Cussen and Block is not the literal, are you going to be a slave of the state, but that they're concerned that it's taking away our libertarian rights. So most of their arguments, 10 arguments, are based on utilitarian principles and positive consequences. And so we'll run through these one by one, and again, often considering potential criticisms. First, free trade benefits all parties because all sides get what they want, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't engage in the trade freely. So somebody who's selling drugs wants the money for the drugs. Somebody who's buying drugs would prefer to give up their money in order to have the drugs. And it seems like a free exchange, just like we all engage in when buying groceries, for example. Now, some might object to the trade of drugs, unlike the exchange of groceries. But then again, some might object to the trade of cigarettes or alcohol or trans fats. But we don't make these things illegal to trade, to buy and sell. So they're saying, sure, some might find this offensive or even something that they would never engage in, but that doesn't mean we restrict it for everyone. A second claim is that crime would be reduced. Now, this is a fairly complicated issue. They raise a few points here. Lowered cost of narcotics would eliminate theft and murder associated with their high prices. So the idea here is that since drugs being illegal makes their cost very high, people might resort to crime, especially theft, in some situations murder, in order to obtain the drugs or in order to maintain a turf so that they could control the drugs in a certain area. Now, this does assume a less than proportional increase in demand. If the cost of drugs are lower, that might allow for an increase in demand, especially if they are legal. And that is certainly a question to investigate. Second point they make about crime is that drug-related gang wars and street violence would be reduced. I hinted at this when I mentioned the murder in point A, the idea that there is a lot of turf wars involved in controlling the drug trafficking. And so if you made them legal, all of that, those kinds of issues would go away. The cartels would go out of business due to lack of profits, cartels being especially violent. And so this would be an overall benefit. Crime would be reduced, and one of the reasons they claim this besides the above is that there no longer would be any illegal drug use, right? If nobody's doing something illegal by using drugs, then of course, by definition, you're going to have less crime. And it would promote social stability. A related argument here is that people who use drugs may grow to have a disrespect for the law and violate laws in other ways. But if drug taking was legal, that would not happen. Let's continue on these points on crime. So they speak about prohibition as an example. And during Prohibition, there were certain mobs, mafia, people controlling the alcohol trade that were violent. And after Prohibition was lifted, those problems were reduced. So alcohol-related crimes, that is, the ones engaged in related to buying and selling, the trafficking, were reduced or eliminated. There are a lot of serious crimes and harms that are alcohol related. So not all crimes were eliminated by Prohibition, certainly, but that's an issue I think we'll take up when we look at Dalrymple's view on the topic. The potency of drugs would decrease. So the idea here is that with drugs being illegal, there's no control of potency, that those people who want to buy and sell drugs are going to make them of higher potency to increase the likelihood of addiction. But if they were legalized, that could be controlled and drugs would be safer. Now, as it is, it's financially beneficial for dealers to make their drugs more potent, more profit, more addiction. And we saw this with Prohibition, that hard liquor was the type of choice. More money was made with the hard liquor since all alcohol was illegal. And the idea is that's the same here, so that people would be using fewer drugs of greater potency. And this would lead to a health benefit, but there are also other health benefits that they emphasize. There would be health benefits due to decreasing risk of infection, for example, through needles being shared, higher quality substances. They give the example of people with diabetes don't get HIV from needles because they use needles legally. Of course, we might ask this, just brief question. Would insurance companies pay for needles for recreational drugs? And of course they would not, but they do pay for needles for diabetics who need to use them. So it's not as if this is quite on a par. Also, they believe that with regulation, we would not have the bad drugs that sometimes hit the market. And the kinds of drugs that are lethal to almost anyone who might use them with one dose. Overall, Cussen and Block believe that society would benefit from drugs being legalized. Here are some of the reasons. As it is, casual users are going to be coming into contact with a criminal culture that they would avoid if drugs were legal. So if you want to use cocaine, you have to come in contact with a criminal culture, and that wouldn't happen if drugs were legal. Inner city youth would not become dealers, would be more likely to get jobs, is the view of Cussen and Block. They would not be tempted to get into the more lucrative drug trade, with drugs being illegal, and so that would not be an option. They'd be more likely to find legitimate work, is their argument. Also, police officers would be less susceptible to corruption, and certainly there have been cases of officers becoming corrupt in order to look the other way with drug trafficking and gang activity. The sixth argument is that we should prohibit the crime, not the drug. So, in other words, if somebody is taking a drug, so Cussen and Block argue, if I ingest a drug, I'm doing possible harm to myself, but not to someone else. And if I'm only harming myself, it shouldn't be prohibited. Now, a response to this might be, again, to speak of alcohol. Is this true, that you're only doing potential harm to yourself when you drink to excess? Well, of course, not in the sense of it increases risks. So 50% of sexual assaults involve alcohol. That is consumption by the perpetrator, the victim, or both, and that's by an NIH study. Child abuse is increased by 40%. I'm sorry, rather, let me restate that. 40% of child abuse involves alcohol or drug abuse. Car accidents, fatalities, 25% involve drugs, about 42% involve alcohol. And so these things are much more likely to occur when someone is under the influence. And so while it may be true that many people might use drugs and only cause harm to themselves and not others, a broad use of drugs certainly would increase risk to many other people, to children, to innocent people driving, and in other situations. A seventh argument from Cussen and Block is that it's going to save the taxpayer money, so taxes could be reduced. Now, how would it save money? Well, at various levels of government, we spend over $20 billion per year on drug enforcement. I don't know what that statistic would be currently, but I would guess it would be more than that. Jails are overcrowded, and often with drug offenders who did no violent crimes. The judicial system is shifting somewhat on this so that fewer people are incarcerated due to use. In fact, over 90% of those incarcerated in a federal system are not there for use, but for selling or buying on a mass scale. And more people could be saved due to fewer people becoming HIV positive or having other diseases due to sharing needles. Again, the idea is this is going to save all of us money when fewer people have diseases to be treated. Now, a response that might be raised here is to question overall, healthcare costs might just increase, because if we make all drugs legal, including the highly addictive ones, there are going to be more people addicted, and treatment is very expensive for these people. And so it's whether or not the amount of money going towards drugs would increase or decrease with making them legal is certainly an open question. And it's pretty clear that more people would use with legalization, although Cussen and Block raise an argument against that. As it is, they argue that having drugs illegal inflates criminals' profits, so we are creating a system where crime pays. And the idea here is that each time a bust occurs or a shipment is captured and destroyed, the criminals benefit. That's a quote from the text. The page number may not be accurate on that, but that's a quote from their article. And the idea here is that this would drive the cost of drugs up so that by and large other people are benefiting more. The supply would decrease, and it's a simple principle of economics. When supply decreases, prices go up. We have greater profits for suppliers. Now, one might ask, would that be true of, say, a bad corn crop for farmers? Well, yes, it would be. If we have a lot of crops being burned, for example, or otherwise going bad, the price of corn would go up. But here's a different question. Would farmers want the price of corn to be increased in that way? Would that be to the benefit of farmers? And the answer is clearly no, right? But that's not going to be to the benefit of farmers. So it would also not be to the benefit of criminals that we are driving up the cost by capturing a lot of drugs at the import of supply, even though other people might benefit. Overall, they do not. Now, I mentioned earlier the elasticity of the demand for drugs. The idea here is how much does one's desire for drugs or one's use of drugs change related to their being illegal or legal. And Cussen and Block argue that most people erroneously believe that the demand for narcotics would increase if it were legalized. Here's their argument against that. I've already hinted that I do believe that, but here's an argument against that. The elasticity of demand is low because narcotics are seen as necessities, not luxuries. In other words, if somebody is taking heroin, it's considered a necessity. It's not a luxury that they're going to use more of if it becomes legal. So it's going to stay steady for those who are already using. Of course, one might ask, going back to that very first argument, is that really a libertarian issue? Are people really free if they are taking a drug that is considered a necessity? It seems like that is actually something that takes away their liberty to pursue happiness. A second point, those people that aren't using drugs when they are illegal, Cussen and Block argue they would not start to use drugs because they already recognize that drugs are dangerous and they wouldn't use them because of that. So those people who are using, when it comes to narcotics at least, that's not going to change. They're going to use whether or not they're legal or illegal. Those people who aren't using now would not suddenly start use them if they were legal because they know how dangerous they are. Now, a response to that is, wouldn't people view them as less dangerous if they are legal? Now, studies have been done with adolescents on this topic, and it's very clear there's a inverse relationship with the degree of perception of how dangerous an activity is with whether or not it's illegal or legal. And if something that was formerly illegal becomes legal, it's just a natural response for people to perceive that as less dangerous. Obviously, it's not as harmful as we thought. That's why we're making it legal. And in turn, use increases. Another point on the idea of the elasticity for the demand of drugs is that if drugs were legal, then they wouldn't be pushed anymore. The idea here is that you have people on the low levels encouraging use, and as it is with drugs being illegal, and so you have pushers is the old term used. Now, this may or may not be a thing that could be regulated and controlled, but certainly if drugs were legal as prescription drugs are, they would be marketed heavily as prescription drugs. Now, maybe there would be separate laws prohibiting the marketing of certain recreational drugs, but as it is now with legal drugs, there is heavy, heavy marketing, and people certainly increase their use because of that marketing. Finally, Cussen and Block want to make the point that legalizing is not government sanctioning. So some people say if the government legalizes drugs, this amounts to government sanctioning the use of drugs, saying it's okay, go ahead and use. And their response is the government would not be sanctioning the use of drugs if they were legal. For example, as an analogy, it's not as if the government sanctions other dangerous activities like car racing, skiing, extreme sports, fried foods, eating fried foods, obviously, nor do we want to make them illegal. So we have these things that are known to be dangerous to people, even snow skiing or extreme sports or eating fried foods, but we don't want to make them illegal. And it's not as if the government is saying, please go do this, right? They're not sanctioning this in that sense. There are legal controls, of course, on some of these activities, but they're not encouraging the use, and Cussen and Block made the point that that would be the case if drugs were legal. The government is not suddenly saying, please go ahead and use these.